Hey guys, welcome to week 3 of PRDN330, where we're looking at Keyshot. This week we are going to be focusing on talking about environments and how those work, how to manipulate them, so on and so forth. For the materials aspect of this, I'm not going to spend as much time on my model on the materials. This is just purely to keep the video length down a little bit lower. I will go through and I still assign materials and all that jazz and go through my normal motions, but I will probably hold off on doing too much to them since the main focus is going to be the environment. This will be the model that everyone will be using here. This is just a simple kettle that I found. It was a Fusion 360 file that I converted into a step, which in the case of some of your assignments later where you're going to be picking your own model, just know that some file types don't work with Keyshot, and in those cases you'll have to convert it into something that does, and steps usually work. Disadvantage of that is currently this is not named at all, so if I wanted to, I'd have to come in here and change all of these names to be what they actually are, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that, just because it doesn't really matter too much at this point. So I'm just going to proceed as is. And again, kind of my workflow of how I generally like to do things is I do materials first, and then I move to environments, and then if I want to tweak materials, I can go back and tweak those. But for starters, let's just start with materials. We're going to make a fairly reflective looking kettle, and the reason for that is just to showcase the environment as much as possible. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just throw down some anodized, shiny, polished aluminum for that. I'm going to throw down some of the normal polished aluminum there. It looks like there's some synced materials, and you can see how some of those other ones changed as well. I'm just going to make sure that those are all the same there. See if there's anything else I wanted to do with aluminum. I think that's pretty good. I do want some sort of like rubber of sorts, probably for that, and that, and that. And the base here, I want this to be like a hard plastic. So I'm going to go to my plastic section. Hard, rough plastic. Notice how it's changing a lot of the other materials at once. What that usually implies is that I need to select it, find it over in the tree, and change that directly to be a hard texture plastic. And the base, I also want to be a hard texture plastic, but yeah, that'll work there. Is there anything else here that looks like, I'm not sure entirely what that is, so if I want to just kind of hide some of the other stuff for now, you can see there's some other parts in there that I need to come back and revisit. So it looks like that's like the inner wall of that. It could just be the way that the step separated it out into two separate surfaces. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to go ahead and make that. Let me see. Yeah, because that's my. This is also polished aluminum there. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this hard textured plastic as well. Kind of see how that looks. My guess is that it's more of like a surface sort of situation in which those two surfaces are making up this one object. And I'm just going to just kind of organize this a little bit here. And let's see, I'm going to add it to a group. Create a new group. Call this heat base, and this is just a little how you might organize stuff in the future. Okay, there we go. So all those are in the heat base portion. So I'm gonna go ahead and hide that. Hide the heat base. Oh, I guess technically this is the heat base. That's okay. We can put that. So let's see what this is. Just kind of checking those out. Hard. Texture. Okay, so that's the only thing there. So this, I guess I can, yeah, I can double check that. Okay, so this is not the heat base. So I can change the name of that. That's the kettle base. And again, I can right click. You can also create subgroups. This is very similar to how it works in Rhino, or add to group. And so in this case here, I will add to group. Actually, I don't want one at that level. I want one. Yeah, down here. Let's go ahead and just grab. I said I wasn't going to organize it, and here I am organizing it just because it's bothering me. So we'll call this the heater, because it's supposed to be, I think, an electric kettle. So that's where I'm getting my information there. Okay, so let's hide the heater, and let's look at this guy. Trying to see what we're dealing with here. It looks like several layers. Those are both aluminum. That's all polished there. So we'll probably just leave that as is. Go ahead and turn those back on. And let's figure out what some of this other stuff here is up. So let's go ahead and take whatever this layer is, which we'll call this, I was calling that the main. That almost looks like the main outside, or that could be the main inside actually. Oh, I see. It's just the top ring and the bottom ring. So yeah, they definitely split the surfaces out. This will be main. We'll call this main top bottom. So the main top and bottom needs to be the same as the anodized aluminum. If I go to my materials here, I'm going to just zoom in. Drag that same material right there, and that should hopefully in theory link those two together. Hopefully. I think there might be a way to link them after the fact. Maybe not. Okay, so I'll run with that. So let's hide those two. Okay, so then we've got a polished on the inside, which I think is fine, actually. I think that is appropriate. If, for whatever reason, you were going to have a render without the top, that would actually make a lot of sense to see the inside of it. And interesting, that is all one surface right there. So we can't really split that out. That's cool. All right, this guy here, all those little pieces there, those are kind of more surfaces there, and I'm gonna go ahead and make those the same aluminum as everything else. So now everything should have a material. We are more or less ready to do some tweaking, and how we're gonna do that. Let's go ahead and start with, I just want to make maybe a quick texture change to my hard textured rubber, which I've got several instances here, as you can see. So I think this will be, where is my handle? So there's my handle as rubber 2. And I think, yeah, that's definitely the one there. That's the one that I want to edit. So I'm going to go to my material graph. This texture here is the noise. I'm actually going to change that. And I was thinking of checking out maybe the leather. No, I don't want to diffuse then. And let's go ahead and hit the C. Let's see how fine that pattern is. Raise that up a little bit more. You can start to see that leather texture kind of coming through there. Yeah, that's actually probably about the level that I want that. Question is it applying it to these other pieces here? Yes, it is. Okay. So let's check that. So that is just there. So then what I'm going to do here is, because I've edited that one, I'm actually going to just change this to a hard textured, if I can here. Hard texture. Oh, I guess I have one of those already set. About hard, rough plastic black. No, you're not going to let me, are you? Come on now. Okay, so in order to separate these different parts here, I'm going to right click this, and under material, I'm going to unlink material. And let's see, the other one would be this piece here. I'm going to do the same thing, material, unlink material, and this one here, material, unlink material. So then now you'll see that I've just generated rubber 2, rubber 3, rubber 4, rubber 5. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to go back to rubber 2 here, right there. I'm going to go to the material graph, and I'm going to change this one back to the noise on the texture. Then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in there so I can see that. Let's see how big it is. I'm going to bring that down a little bit more. Like so. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to, because I like that texture and I want the other two to match that same one. Actually, you know what? I might make these a little bit different as well. Maybe a slightly different type of rubber. So this one here, I'm going to go back to my rubbers that I have. I guess that's just straight up rubber. Yeah, I guess we can just tweak it. So we'll go here. This one is going to be rubber number 4. So I'm double click that one, pop up my material graph, get rid of the leather. I'm going to mess with this here, bring the refractiveness down, make it a little bit darker. And for the texture on this one, I think I might go with maybe this fractaled one here. See how that looks. Don't really like that one. Maybe instead, let's just try this one just for kicks and giggles. See how this looks. No, I'm trying to make this look kind of more like a gasket sort of thing, which would imply that it's more porous. Maybe the cellular. That's way too big for starters. Yeah, that's something. Sure, let's go with that. Just to give it a slightly different look. So I'm going to go ahead and take that rubber number 4, and let me make sure before I click it. Yeah, I'm going to make that Same one over here. Let's see, copy material, paste material, there we go. So that same material is now on both of those. So now we've got 3 different types of rubbers there, 1, 2, and 3. And that's just a little brief example of how you can kind of tweak your settings just a little bit to give you slightly different results and have different appearances for your materials there. For my hard plastics down here, I'm gonna wait until I start tweaking with my environment, and I do kind of want to throw in some scratches on this, so it's just not perfect. So I will go ahead and bring in, actually let me look at my, this might be way overkill, but I'm kind of curious to see what this looks like. Oh yeah, that's way overkill. We don't want that. So let's just quickly take a peek at the library and see what kind of scratches they have. Screw thread, rusty paint scratches. Interesting. Why don't we try that one just for kicks? Any other ones that we can see that look mildly interesting? Brushed stainless. That could be interesting. Fingerprints? Sure. Put some fingerprints on it. And what else do we got? That'll do for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with, see how bad this rusty paint scratches looks. Probably pretty bad. So let's see what kind of adjustments we can make. Oh my. I definitely don't like that at all. That's terrible. No. So let's go with our normal scratches, which is under textures, scratches. Add those to bump. And then I'm also going to do a bump add, so I can do a secondary bump. And I'm going to add in fingerprints as another one. And we'll go need to adjust both of these. So for this one, for starters, something like that. Move texture. Unfortunately, you can see how there's multiple instances of it, which is kind of unrealistic. Take off two-sided. Take off repeat. There we go. Now we've only got one instance of a handprint, hopefully. Two-sided is still on. Why you do this to me? And let's see, what else can we do to this? Okay, there, two-sided went off. Okay, scratches, let's go ahead and isolate that. Raise the scale a little bit. Bring the density way down. We don't need loads of scratches. Maybe just a little bit more density. maybe even less than that, like 0.5, 0.3. There we go. It's just a few there. Maybe even less dense than that. Okay, so now we put a few little scratches in it. And my fingerprints, I'm still not super stoked with those. All right, we're gonna forego the fingerprints for now until I can better figure out how to map them. For now, I'm just gonna stick with my few little scratches that I put on here. And we'll go ahead and just leave it with that and move on for now. So when talking about environments, that will be under the Environment tab. And again, we're starting here with our normal HDR environment here. That's just kind of the studio lighting sort of situation. And that is what is actually lighting this object. The background currently could be a color. It could just be this gray color. It could be a gradient. You could do a sun in the sky. I guess right now actually they're changing the whole HDR environment. My bad. Usually it is an image, but you can, under settings here, yeah, there it is. Under background, you can actually make it a color, just an individual color. That's what I was trying to show. So let me just back up there. Settings and HDR Editor, two different things. Settings are your standard environment settings, and then the HDR Editor are what's editing this image that is creating the light for your object. So we'll start with settings. First of all, you can see there that we're using the startup HDR. I have my brightness and contrast adjustment here, so I can raise the brightness, which will make this much brighter or darker, as you can see there, and the contrast, which also will change the way the lighting affects whether it's a greater contrast, lesser contrast. The size of the environment, this changes a lot depending on how big your object is. So if you see here, if I make a itty bitty teeny tiny environment, it's not enough light to light my object. So I have to make it big enough, and you can see there where the kind of imaginary size is right now. The entire environment here is like this big, which is not very big at all. So we want this to be more normal sized, which was somewhere up here, I think. I forget exactly where it was. Height here raises or lowers the height, and that will make a difference depending on what your environment looks like and what objects are being shown up in the reflections. You can rotate it around depending on how you like to see the lighting and what kind of features you want to display from your lighting environment. And then, like I said, the background can either be your lighting environment. So here you'll notice you can actually see the rotating environment. But if I have a color as my background, you actually won't see that rotating. You'll only see the color, which is super helpful, and that will play into our project assignment that's coming up here. Backplate image, this is where you can put in a backplate, just a plain image, and then you can place this within the image, which is something that I will be kind of showing a little bit later. But for now, we're going to just use a blank white background, and then we're going to light everything else with our environment. So I'm going to go over here to my environment tab, and I'm going to grab a new environment. Since I want this to appear as if it is inside someone's kitchen, I'm probably going to use this apartment here. It's kind of got a nice warm color hues, as you can see. I like that. I like those colors a lot, so I'm going to use that instead. If you notice, straight away, our reflective material went from looking very matte, not a lot going on, to looking suddenly very reflective. And the reason for that is because we went from having just hues of gray to actually having an environment to reflect, which is what you can see here. So straight off the bat, size-wise, this actually looks right about the right size. And I can rotate the environment around to see if there's a different view that I like a little bit more. But I do quite like the way that it looks, and it makes a lot of sense that it would be sitting next to a window. So I'm going to kind of leave that window painting those nice bright lights right here. Size, like I said, looks about right. I can raise the brightness a bit more. I can darken it up. Notice how that affects it. Brighter seems better for me, so I'm gonna go with brighter. Contrast at the moment, if we go for lighter contrast there, don't really dig that. Like the slightly darker contrast. And again, a lot of this rendering stuff is going to be up to you as the designer, and how, when you look at an object, what appears to look better and what doesn't appear to look better. I have a hard time conveying that across. I will do my best to just talk through my thought process as I'm doing things, but ultimately it will be up to you as the designer to do your best and use your references of things that you've seen in real life, and just spend a lot of time trying to make this look as good as possible. And if you notice here, this bright area here is the reflection of this silver portion on this portion, I do believe is what's happening there. That's what it looks like to me, and that's the reflection of that on there. Cool, cool, cool. Just wanted to double check that. You can see the handle there as well reflecting. Down here on the ground, these are some options for how our ground behaves. If you take off ground shadows, for example, you'll get just like the floating object there. Usually you want to leave ground shadows on. That gives you that nice shadow. The only reason you might not want to do that is in some particular cases where it's more difficult to leave them on than to turn them off. Occlusion ground shadows, I believe, has to do with the way that it's scattering the light. You can also change the color of your ground shadows if for some reason you wanted, for example, see how this is be a more yellow light or something, right? So for some reason, if I come here, I can actually change the tone of my shadows. I don't recommend doing something super wild and extreme that doesn't really make sense, unless it's for some sort of artistic purposes or theme purposes. But maybe adding a subtle hint of some sort of color to your shadows might do something interesting. For the most part, in general, in real life, shadows are going to be appearing as black, unless you're using another lighting source that is actually giving it some sort of color, which is kind of why I was thinking of doing it, only because this is very warm lighting. So my thought process behind it was just give it a little bit of a warm shadow. So we'll go ahead and just do that, just to give it a little bit of warmer of a shadow. Flatten ground, you can see the differences between the two. It changes on how the reflection, notice how it kind of straightens out at the last minute versus unflatten. I think in this instance, you can also notice the reflection here, how that changes. It does make it look like it's sitting on the floor. Let me adjust the height. I don't know if it's going to do much. Oh, there we go. So you can see it's like sitting on the floor now. You can see that difference there. I don't know if I like the flattening ground in this application. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down a little bit there where I had it before. Ground reflections, if it's on a reflective surface, this is super handy, which will come into play a little bit here. Ground size also plays an effect of how your object looks. Notice how far my shadow is out there. So this is at what, 5724. So if I change that to 10, notice how my ground is no longer reflecting. If I change that to 1000, notice how it's clipping my shadows. If I change that to 5700, which was closer to where it was, my shadows are no longer being clipped, which is kind of what I want in general. So those are the basic adjustments there. Again, fairly straightforward. Once you play around with them, the important thing is kind of noticing how it affects your image and, again, what looks good versus what doesn't. Under the HDR Editor, this is where things get a little more interesting. HDR Editor is where you can actually edit this image here. And I think there's a way to get this to pop up into a tab. Just to see a little bit better of what it is you're working on. I know that you can adjust it there. I swear there was a way. Well, either way, we'll play with it like so. So what I just did there, and I'll just kind of walk through this first, and then we'll start tweaking stuff. First, you have these things here called pins. So you can add a pin, add a gradient pin, add an image pin, add a copy pin. Then we have the HDR Editor canvas. Oh, that was the pop-out that I was probably thinking of. Yeah, you can see that a little bit bigger there. That just brings this out to be a little bit bigger. You can export the HDRI or save it to the library. In case for whatever reason you were using the same environment again after you've set it up for something else, you could export all the changes that you've made to it. So I believe this brightness and contrast is also affecting very similarly to how this brightness and contrast, it's more effective to the immediate image that we're working with right here. You also have saturation and hue. So for example, I could take a lot of the color out of here. Notice how my colored metal is still showing colored, but how everything else seems to have lost all of its color. And you can see there, I can bring it back. I can make it super oversaturated, which looks disgusting. I'm going to leave it somewhere right around 50%, which is right smack dab in the middle, because that looks decent. Hue, here you can change the hue of it. Again, not really sure why you would do something like that, but it happens. Transform, you can tilt it or rotate it, depending on the image that you're using. Blur, you can add blurriness here. Notice how that affects the metal, especially the reflective one. So I chose that for a very specific reason, because it allows you can't hide anything when you're using reflective materials. So when you blur stuff like this, that tells you more about the finish of the material than the environment. But in this case, I'm just leave it blurry, like so, or sorry, clear, zero blur. Colorize, here you can add a little bit of color to it. This works a little bit better in my opinion than the hueing, because this is a more subtle addition. Although it behaves in some ways like the hue, you have a little bit more control in how much color you're adding. So for example, you can see how warm it is here. And if I go over to the blue section to mix in some coolness, you can see here how I'm dialing in the cool. And now this looks way cooler than it did before, as in cool as in temperature. I don't actually like the way that it looks. I like it warm, so I'm gonna leave it warm. And yeah, let's go back and look at those pins a little bit more closely. So with the pins, when I just add a pin, and I'll go ahead and open up the HDR Editor canvas so you can see a little bit more clearly here what I'm doing. This is a pin that I'm adding here. And you can kind of see how it's affecting in my reflection there. Essentially what it is it's actually adding a bright white spot that I can move around in my environment. So like up here to the top. And there you can actually get a good idea of how big my environment is. You can kind of see how that's reflecting here. You can also change the shape of this, and if you do something like a rectangle like this, for the size, you can do the X and the Y, just like so. You can see how that is. If you are familiar with Photoshop and blend modes, they have blend modes in here. So this is add, meaning it's adding the white to what is existing. Blending is like a more subtle version of adding. Alpha is where it's straight up just adding in this white square. And then screening is a similar to alpha. I'm not entirely sure the difference between those two, but you likely will be using a combination of add, blend, and alpha depending on what it is you're trying to do. One of the useful things that you can really do with this is, let's just say, for example, this highly reflective, I'm going to try to take my pin out real quick just to see what I'm looking at with the normal environment. Let's just say, for example, I wanted to get rid of just this part of the reflection. Let's say that that was too bright and I wanted to make that a little bit darker. What you can do is you can create a pin. I can bring it over to where that spot is. I'm going to make it a rectangle, and for the size, I'm going to try to make this fit inside that window, and you can kind of see what I'm dealing with the pin up here. And what I can do is I can actually make that black instead of white, and instead of adding, I'm going to make it an alpha, and that completely wipes that out. So maybe it needs to be more like a blend. Take the brightness of that, turn it down a bit more. Maybe that's where screening comes into play. I swear I did this the other day and it worked great. It is a way of removing lights. It may be a little bit trickier when you're dealing with stuff that's highly reflective. In this case, with this material being highly reflective, it might be a better application if you were doing something that was a little less reflective so you couldn't see it. Because otherwise, I'm assuming that's why it's actually showing up as just a black square. In any case, it is still technically removing that light like I wanted it to. It's just obviously a giant black square. So you could, if you wanted to, blend that in with a slightly more reasonable color. Yeah, there we go. Actually, that looks decent. So there, in a way, I've kind of taken out that window. And if I hadn't told you that I did that, and I even did a little bit better blending than I've currently done, then yeah, you could make that, you could hide some of the elements of this environment. Likely that won't be your most used case. The most used case is when you are trying to add lights that you don't have. So you can add pins. Gradient pins allow you to add in a gradient, and you can see here how you can control the gradient. going from darkest to lightest. And again, you can light from down below here. You can kind of see this bright, and obviously this is some sort of red purple menagerie thing here that's going on, so that's not quite what we want to do. So I'm going to bring this up to something that looks a little bit more like the floor. And notice this reflection that I've now created. It's a little bit brighter. You can see it kind of moving around the base. Let's move it around. So let's say I want to actually add just a bit more there. Let's go ahead and make it a bit bigger. I don't want to actually see it, so I kind of want to just add it below, like so. And stop brightness. Not sure what that is at the moment. Oh, maybe each individual stop. Maybe that's what it's referring to. Add opacity stop, add stop. Color black to white. That's probably referring to your opacity, and this is referring to the color. Brightness of this. Again, this refers to the pin of whether it's like super bright, so you can see how much I'm lighting up the base of it now versus just a little bit bright. And I would say in general, most things that you're doing are should be subtle, as subtle as possible. So in this case, the better way of doing this would probably just be to add a normal pin, bring it down here, make it a blend, bring the brightness up closer to match those other sunspots, raise the radius a bit more. See, where's the front of it? There's the front of it there. Let's do something a little bit more. It's looking like I need to stretch across this, so I'm actually going to switch that to a rectangle, and I'm going to make it not super tall, but I'm going to connect the width-wise something a little bit more like that. Okay, that looks decent. So you can see now I've got a little bit more reflection here. I've added in this extra little bit here to kind of just give it a little bit more front. And the reason I'm kind of doing that is I'm just seeing the way that the handle is reflecting. It's got a little bit of light that's coming evenly across this way, so I want to kind of reflect that as well down here. And, oh shoot, okay, yeah, go back to that. Perfect. Image pins are where you can add in another image to reflect in here. So let's just say, for example, and I'm definitely not advocating this because I don't think this would be the best way to do it, but if for some reason you wanted to reflect something very particular, let's just say, I'll give you a bad example, then I'll try to give you a good example. So a bad example would just be like you're trying to essentially show an additional object in here that you want to reflect. So you have an image of it, you throw it in here, and then you're able to get a reflection of an object. Maybe it's something else that you want to render in it, but you don't have access to the model. That's a terrible example. A better example would just be, let's just say you have a granite countertop that you have an image of the granite countertop. You could bring in the image of the granite and actually use that to build. Even though this image may not have granite in it, you could actually add in an image of granite to help with the realism of the model that you're creating. The other one that they have is copy pin, and this I believe works where you can take copy of a part of the environment and then paste it somewhere else. So if you're trying to duplicate like a specific lighting from a certain area, and you can see there the yellow is what I'm duplicating, and then the blue is the other result. So not going to use that in this case. For the most part of what the simplicity of this example, I'm just going to use this one pin for now. I think that looks decent. And is there anything else that I can talk about here? These are, again, the different types of HDRI environments. Image is what we're using. You can use these standard ones, but I would recommend just using an image. The only time that we're going to be using a color is when we talk about lighting next week. And this is a multi-week sort of thing that we're going to be talking about with lighting, because you can light stuff a variety of different ways. And in some of those cases, it involves using no HDR environment. And so we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's just the basics of kind of how those environments work. The nice thing too is that you can lock this environment, save it as something else, create a new environment, and then completely design something different, and then alternate between the two and see which one you like, without having to memorize all your stuff and then go back in. It does give you that option up here. And yeah, so with that, let's talk about the assignment here. That's going to be about creating a model. First of all, your exercise is going to be to use this kettle and to generate a nice looking render, again dealing with the materials and then moving into the environment. Don't use the same environment that I did. Try something different. There's lots of different ones here. If you're not happy with any of those, just hop into the cloud library. There's plenty more in here that you can try out. I would 100% recommend and basically ask you to use real environments. So don't use any of these ring lights or the studio ones. Use the ones that are actual environments here of places. And then create a render, save it out. You only need to do a couple views, I would say, and just double check the sheet. I'll put how many different angles I want on it. But yeah, mess around with those HDRI settings, mess around with the pins, see how you can tweak that environment to look as good as possible. And then with that, your first project is going to be to design, or you can base it off something else that already exists, but basically to model a simple kitchen appliance, such as a kettle like this, and to render it in context with a backplate image. And the reason I'm asking for that is also because we will be talking about lighting next week, and the project won't be due for several weeks, so you will have a little bit more background into additional lighting techniques, and that will assist with some of the matching. But for now, I will show you real quick here how to use a backplate image and just a little bit about matching into that. Just real quick here about using backplate images. I will be going more in depth into how to better match your object lighting to basically just how to better match for a backplate image. This is just a real quick example. I haven't done much to this one at all. But just basically the way that this is going to work is you're going to add in a backplate image. There are backplate images located in the cloud library here. And then when you download those, you just double click it. It'll apply it on here. And then you'll notice here, the way that your view works is the image becomes static and your object moves around. So figuring out how to place it within the image and be able to size it correctly, get the angle right so that it looks like as if it's sitting on a surface, and then be able to, you know, rotate the environment around until it matches closely to the other objects. So like I'm looking at things like this reflection here and showing it here, sort of things like that. We're going to be looking at those a little bit more next week in the lighting. So for the starters for this week for your project, it's going to be definitely focusing on the model portion, and then we will be focusing a little bit more on the rendering aspects of that project next week in next week's video. But for now, I just wanted to quickly show you backplates, get you kind of thinking about those, how those work on top of environments, because you can see here that that's my lighting environment that I'm working with at the moment, and that's my backplate, and how those kind of work there. But yeah, with all that being said, hopefully that was somewhat informative and helps get you a little intro into using the environment. So be sure to render out your kettles and save those JPEGs, and take a look at the project prompt, and we'll talk about that on Thursday a little bit. Have a good week.